Hi, it's my wolf pack, Charlie Black 20, and we are back again with the next video on the Nuremberg trials, where today what we will be covering is the defense strategies of the defendants during the trial. Now, the very first thing to mention is that the lawyers, every single Nazi lawyer, or German lawyer, I should say, not all of them were Nazis, they all challenged the legitimacy of the trial. They said international law had never been used in a trial. This was completely new. This had never been done. So this was an ex post facto law, meaning that the laws that were being used to charge the defendants had not existed before the defendants committed their crimes. And in Anglo-American law systems, that is a very important thing. You can't charge somebody with a new law retroactively. But the prosecution pointed out that there were things within the international community that were commonly held to work together to prevent such horrible wars from happening. They'd been done before. There were international groups that worked together already, so they had that as a precedent. And also, they basically argued that the first person to commit murder couldn't probably made the same argument that, hey, nobody had ever murdered before, so why are you charging me now? Yeah, it's a little harder to explain in that sense, but basically the defense tried to argue that this was victor's justice, that this was ex post facto, that this was not a legitimate trial. And the prosecution managed to really legally shut that down without, without saying that it was victor's justice, which I do not believe it was, because otherwise these defendants wouldn't have gotten a trial at all. Nor would it have been a fair trial, which they definitely got a fair trial. One of the defenses that was not supposed to be allowed to be used by the defendants was what was known as a tu quoque, which means you did it too. So the Nazi leadership couldn't point to the Allies and say, hey, you did something just as bad, or you did it before us. They couldn't claim that that was a defense, that you did it too, which would actually become very complicated when it came to Admiral Karl Donitz, where his lawyer actually managed to use a very complicated version of tu quoque to defend Donitz. Now, the defense strategies are varied based on the individual who was being charged. So, for example, Goering, the top dog of this trial, completely defiant to the end. He was extremely intelligent and charismatic. He hammered the prosecution by his logic, his ways of turning things back on the prosecution, and basically showing that he didn't care about the trial as a legal thing. He really did believe that it was just victor's justice. There was nothing to this. This was just that the Germans lost the war and they were going to pay the price. That was it. But as the trial went on and the horrors of the war, and particularly the concentration camps and the fate of the Jews, was shown and proven by the documents in court, he started to deny his role, despite being the second man in Germany, number 2 only to Hitler. He continued to deny and evade his responsibility personally. Like he said, I accept full responsibility for the German war effort, the pre-war rearmament, how we occupied things, how we took over places, but I am not responsible for the crimes of the Holocaust or anything that happened in those camps. That was under Himmler. In fact, Goering had the nerve to claim that he didn't believe that even Hitler knew the full scale of what was going on, because Himmler kept those things secret from even Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering. Not only one of the best pieces of evidence to show that Goering was a complete liar, on that front at least, was that there was a meeting between Admiral Horthy, who was the regent of Hungary in 1943, between him, Hitler, and von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister. You see, Ribbentrop is below Goering in the hierarchy, and he and Hitler are meeting with Horthy about deporting the Jews of Hungary to Auschwitz. And Horthy's saying, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm already passing anti-Semitic laws, and what more do you want me to do? I can't simply kill them. And in the meeting, Ribbentrop says the only fate for these Jews is extermination or being sent to concentration camps. There's no other alternative. And Hitler goes on this long tirade about how the Jews are like a tuberculi, they're a bacillus, they're a virus, a disease, and that even innocent animals need to be put to death when they are diseased, and that you need to rid yourself of this disease of the Jews. And the prosecution pointed out that Ribbentrop and Hitler discussed extermination, and Goering was above Ribbentrop. He was second in command. And then the British really, under Maxwell Fyfe, really hammered Goering on what was known as the Stalag 50. This was when about 50 British airmen escaped a POW camp and then were captured and summarily shot. Like, they were recaptured, just shot. And Goering tried to avoid this as a stain on his reputation as a fellow airman from World War I. But it was proved that not only did he know about it, he gave the orders to do it. And he tried to evade, saying, no, I was on leave that day. No, that's not my signature that time. But I didn't get consulted about this. No, they had the written orders. They had his signature. He did it. He signed the orders. He gave the approval. And so that's, in the end, I think that's what really did him in, especially when it came to the quote-unquote appeals process. So Goering was defiant as a statesman, but when it came to the crimes of the Holocaust and the horrors and atrocities, he tried to avoid it by all costs. Denials, evasions, whatever it took. Then you had Rudolf Hess, who was a very strange man in the end. He claimed that he had amnesia after he was captured by the British in 1941 and thrown in prison. And for the next 4 years, he claimed to have no real memory of his life before that, other than snippets. And he kept claiming that the British were trying to poison him and trying to kill him. And then in February 1945, he claimed his amnesia was gone. And then in July, he claimed his amnesia was back, until he was thrown into the Nuremberg cells, where, upon seeing Hermann Goering, he immediately gave the Hitler salute to Goering. And Goering knew at that point, along with a lot of other American prosecutors, that Hess was lying. He could remember. It was a ploy. He wasn't a mentally stable man to begin with, and I think that at this point, he's just trying to save his own neck, because he probably knows that the Russians are after his head. Then another defense that was done by Wilhelm Frick and Walter Funk, Minister of Interior and President of the Reichsbank, they claimed in their defenses that they had great titles But within the Nazi hierarchy, where they were fighting for control within the Nazi bureaucracy and all these uh, neo-feudal feuds of bureaucracy with each other, they ended up losing out on those fights, thereby losing power and influence with Hitler and within the Nazi hierarchy. So therefore, they had titles, but not much power to do anything. And that was actually, it seemed to have been fairly true that Funk especially had lost any influence whatsoever. But when it was revealed that he knew exactly where the gold and how it was gotten from the concentration camps, from their victims, that it was proven that he knew that the SS were doing this, he was in a lot of trouble and he knew it. He had a breakdown at that point. Wilhelm Frick actually did not testify in his own defense, which was his right in the trial, but he called to the stand somebody who could defend his position that he was not a powerful mover and shaker within the Nazi hierarchy. But to do that, this man, I believe his name was Gisevius, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it. But this man, he was a known resistance member to Hitler. He was a resistance fighter against Hitler and had been since the early days. He had knowledge of the bomb plot. He had managed to escape with his life to Switzerland, and he gave so much evidence revealing just how bad the corruption, how horrible the Nazi regime was, from the criminal activities of the Gestapo, where he tried to turn evidence over against the Gestapo and was told that if he didn't stop, he'd be arrested. He joined the Abwehr, where Admiral Canaris was a main mover and shaker of the resistance to Hitler. And he gave a lot of evidence against, especially Goering, revolving around certain pre-war politicking about the Blomberg-Fritsch affair, which I will not go into here. I suggest you go and look it up. I will provide a link in the description. So Frick tried to use this to defend himself, but in the end, it was really more of a black mark on everybody else. And Frick was a particularly cold man. Like, after they'd watched the film on the concentration camps, when Hans Fritzsche came to him and said it was a pretty hard movie to watch, Frick said, yeah, I wonder what they're going to serve us for dinner. Pretty cold. Then you had the quote-unquote soldiers. So you had Jodl, Keitel, Raeder, and Denounced, all of whom claimed that they were following orders and being obedient soldiers of the Third Reich, and that it was their duty to obey those orders, and that they were merely, most of them, they argued that, especially Keitel, that they were tools who were doing their duty for their home, for their country. Now, Keitel and Jodl had both signed orders that, and Raeder too, that really implicated them in the Nazi conspiracy charge, the war crimes charge, and the crimes against humanity charge, and crimes against peace. They were in deep, very deep. Erich Raeder, although he'd been a conservative before the Nazis came to power, he had backed Hitler. He had been Hitler's chief of the admiralty. He'd been the head admiral until 1943, when he's replaced by Denounced. And after the bomb plot, he had gone to Hitler with a pistol, past his bodyguards, and then berated the bodyguards for not searching him and showing that he was loyal to Hitler by doing this. So Raeder never denounced Hitler, and neither did, and Keitel, in a way, he did. He claimed that his loyalty had been misplaced by trusting in Hitler and following him to the very end. But all the evidence pointed to orders that he signed, that he gave approval of, especially the Commissar order, the Night and Fog decree, where suspected resistance members were seized in the middle of the night and secretly murdered. Jodl too, doing the same thing. Although it's well known that Keitel was way more of a loyal lapdog than that Jodl was very much his own man in many ways, arguing with Hitler to the end of the days, but he never opposed Hitler. He never tried to stop him. And then again, Denounced. His lawyer was very, very clever. He asked to get a interrogatory, a memo from Admiral Nimitz in the Pacific Theater for the Americans, and the prosecution tried to stop him from doing this by saying he can't argue a tu quoque defense on the naval warfare. And he said, no, I'm not asking about what was done. I'm asking what was the practice. Because if the practice was the same, then I'm saying that that was legal, what we did, because we would be in agreement on how naval warfare should be fought. And this little bit of legal wrangling really worked. This is what will save Denounced's life, because he would be acquitted on the Navy stuff, because the British and the Americans, Nimitz sent the memo saying, no, we fought the exact same way against the Japanese that the Nazis fought against us. And it was viewed kind of erroneously, but not completely erroneously, that the German Navy had fought a fairly clean war. They hadn't done anything beyond the scope of what anybody else did. So Denounced, but he was known to be a hardcore Nazi and completely and believing in the idea of the poison of Jewry. So a very hard man, a very hard soldier. Then you had Rosenberg and Streicher. Their defense was pretty simple. They would deny things, but they would justify other things that they did by pointing out that the crimes against the Jews weren't crimes at all, because the Jews were to blame. The Jews brought this on themselves, so we had to do this. As dirty work as it was, this is what we had to do. The Slavs, the same thing. Rosenberg defended his hard iron hand and his ruthlessness in the occupied territories by saying, hey, they were just Slavs, they were just Jews and gypsies. They're a lesser race. We can do what we want. We have to. Streicher, same thing. He made the mistake of blaming his lawyer for so much, and then, just being a completely vile man. And they denied so much. That was really all their defense was, anti-Semitism and denials. Then you had the two most pitiful of the group. You had Kaltenbrunner and you had Ribbentrop. And they both just denied, evade. Kaltenbrunner denied ever being in almost any concentration camp. He denied that he knew about the death camps, that he knew about the slave labor. He denied that he knew that these things happened, but it wasn't him. It was Heydrich. It was Himmler. It was Hitler. And it was Kaltenbrunner who actually who called to the defense as a witness. He called Rudolf Huss, the commandant of Auschwitz, to prove he hadn't been in Auschwitz. Boy, was that a mistake for the entire defense people. And it didn't help Kaltenbrunner much at all. And then Ribbentrop. He was probably one of the most pitiful men in Nuremberg. Like, nobody had any sympathy for him. He was nothing about him seemed to have it. He had no courage. He didn't try to maintain any discipline like the soldiers. He didn't try to, he tried to claim that he did everything for Hitler, that Hitler gave the orders, he just followed them. He didn't take any initiative. He didn't do anything of his own free will. But it showed through the evidence just how tied to the genocide he was, and how tied to the foreign atrocities and the breaking of foreign treaties, like how he did not use diplomacy for anything other than to get what Germany wanted, and he didn't care how he did it. He threatened war, he threatened atrocities, he claimed that he was working under Hitler's direct supervision. He tried to claim that he could have controlled the SS when he couldn't. He had no real defense. And so he just became a huge crybaby, you could say. Then you had men like Sykes-Inquart and Sauckel, who claimed that that they were acting for Germany, in Germany's best interests, and also being humane by having lighter touches than other Nazis did. So the one thing that those two didn't do is they did not denounce Hitler. They both stayed loyal to Hitler. Sauckel claimed he was completely innocent, that he called for humane treatment, but there were orders that he signed saying it doesn't matter how you get those laborers into Germany, just get them there by whatever means necessary. And he claimed that he didn't know what was going on in all the camps and factories with slave labor. He knew. All of his memos show that. The next group is far more interesting, where you've got Hans Frank, Baldur von Schirach, and Albert Speer, because all three of these men were up to their necks in criminality, but the one thing they did was they denounced Hitler, and they denounced the crimes of the Nazis. Hans Frank, he turned over his 40 volumes of diaries that he'd written as Governor General of Poland, and he expressed remorse. He said 1,000 years will pass, and this guilt will not be removed from the German people. But Frank had also reconverted to Catholicism. He'd tried to kill himself twice while in custody by slashing his wrists. And he was, when the prosecution started to probe into more questions and probe deeper, they started to get more personal evasions rather than complete acceptance. And during the closing, during his closing statement, Frank actually said that the crimes that the Soviets had committed against the Germans in East Germany wiped away the stain of what the Nazis did to Russia. Sure it does. Then Schirach, he denounced Hitler. He said, I was loyal to the man when I shouldn't have been. I followed a man who committed murder 1,000-fold. And he tried to, quote unquote, defend the Hitler youth. He said our youth were not to blame. Yes, they were anti-Semitic, but they weren't murderers. They weren't killers. They don't need to be tarred with the brush of Adolf Hitler. And then Speer, his was the most fascinating defense because he was extremely smart, extremely well-spoken, and very, very manipulative. So he did denounce Hitler. He also defied Hitler. When Hitler gave his Nero decree, which was to destroy all German infrastructure and leave the Allies nothing, destroy the infrastructure for all the German people, destroy bridges, railroads, factories, mines, anything that could be of use, because he was going to condemn the German people to death with him. Speer, along with several others, defied those orders, sabotaged the orders, and made sure that they didn't get carried out or they were countermanded. And he also claimed that he tried to kill Hitler with a poison gas in February of 1945. And there was a requisition order that he got from his munitions, his head of munitions, for poison gas to kill Hitler with. but that when he was going to go and do it, the area that he needed to get access to was heavily guarded now, and that there was a 12-foot chimney at the air intake valve, air intake shaft, and he couldn't get to it anymore without, getting killed. So his plan came to nothing. So I think Speer did take that risk, but it came to nothing, and I don't think he was actually trying that hard. And he also said, listen, what we did as the Nazis, we were wrong. We shouldn't have done it. We brought a great tragedy upon ourselves and the world, and we shouldn't have done it. We were wrong. And but the one thing he did do is he didn't claim personal responsibility. He claimed a collective responsibility for all the leaders of the Third Reich, and he was accepting his part of it. But when it came to him personally, he defended himself by saying, listen, I did ask Salco to get me the labor I needed, and I did revamp the German economy for a war economy. I did do these things, but I didn't know exactly what was going on in the factories because I wasn't going down to the factories. I wasn't doing that. I was busy trying to keep the war industry going. So I wasn't in those places to see all those things. And I wasn't part of the final solution because I needed workers. And at the time, there wasn't enough evidence to prove that he was, at least not fully. So those three denounced Hitler. And they expressed not only remorse, but a responsibility. Then you've got Franz von Papen and Hjalmar Schacht. Their defense was that they had been out of power from the Nazi hierarchy for years at this point. Von Papen, yes, he helped get Hitler into power. He helped him maintain power for a while. But for the last 4 to 6 years, he'd been ambassador to different countries. He had not been involved in the big planning of the genocide, the war, the conspiracy. He had not been a big player at all. He hadn't been involved. And Schacht, he said, yes, I helped pre-war Germany up to 1937. I helped get the economy back on board from the Great Depression. But when Hitler started pushing more military expenditure, I opposed that, and I got sacked for it, or I resigned. I resigned from the Reichsbank because I disagreed with Hitler on military rearmament to such an extent that it would hurt the economy. So Schacht, and also in 1944, Schacht himself was thrown into a concentration camp. Now, it was a VIP concentration camp. He got a nice room, you could say, compared to the rest. But he was in prison as a suspected resistance member when he was liberated by the Allies, or captured, I should say. So these two men, their defense was that they were not within the inner circle at the critical points, and more importantly, that Schacht had actually opposed Hitler in many ways. And the Wilhelm Frick, the witness he called to defend him, he actually was a bigger defense witness for Schacht, saying the only reason we didn't go to Schacht was because he was an enigma to us. We didn't know where he stood, but if we'd had the chance, if our coup had succeeded, we would have brought Schacht in. Now to the last guy, Hans Fritzsche. He was on trial simply for being a low subordinate of Goebbels. He had never met Hitler. He had never met most of the defendants before, and he was basically what you would call a third-rate propagandist on the news. Like, I think that of all the defendants, even though he claims he didn't know anything, I think he was probably the most innocent in the fact that even though he was part of the Nazis and he was probably aware that there were bad things going on, he really didn't sign any orders. He didn't issue any memos. He didn't do any of that kind of stuff. He wasn't part of the inner workings of the Nazi Party. He was a low-level guy. So those were the defense strategies. And whether or not they worked, well, guess what? You're going to have to wait till the next video to find out. So guys, take care, my wolf pack.